So Yogesvara, today you are going to talk to us about nonviolence in a violent age, which is pretty much on point with what's going on in the world right now. And trying or maybe having the answers to following questions: is a rational approach possible? What is the proper response in a time of violent rioting and racism? Are love and compassion always the correct course of action? And what is a spiritual warrior? It's all yours. Please tell us more.
Let me start by offering thanks to my teacher, Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swami. That's the protocol and Vaishnav devotional culture. But we acknowledge that there are different categories of knowledge. There's material knowledge which you can acquire from books and from an education and from life experiences. And then there's another kind of knowledge which is inaccessible to our normal tools of observation and learning. That knowledge is obtainable in a descending path, meaning if one receives that knowledge from sources outside of the usual realm of material teaching, from a realized master, from revealed texts, sometimes also from inspiration within our own hearts, although we don't always know when we're actually inspired or just following our imagination, so that you need some verification. So the offering of a thanks to one's teacher in the Bhakti school is a way of saying, I don't really have anything to offer you, but I can try to present for your consideration what I've learned from my teacher and his teacher before him, and going back in what is called the Guru Parampara, or disciplic line of teachings back to the dawn of time. This is a particularly tricky question that I've been asked to talk about with you today. This is the New York Times from 3 days ago. If you can see that headline. All right, so this is just two examples of mass shootings of among hundreds that are taking place each year now, not just here, but around the world. And sometimes we have to ask ourselves, what's going on? What is happening? What is making the difference between the world as we might have envisioned it when we were younger and what we're experiencing, what we're seeing around us today? So there's different ways of approaching this. And this is why I find it a tricky issue. If we talk about violence, what's the level that's most meaningful to all of us? Well, it's violence that might happen to us personally. You know, we can talk about violence on a global scale, on a political scale. We can talk about our moment in historic time and the things that have unleashed this bitter, angry side of human nature. And we should talk about that. The dimension of the discussion that I think probably interests those of us on this call today is the dimension that touches us personally. Right? Who's that you got there? Hi.
That's my daughter, Tara. I managed to get her all set before the meeting, but hugs were not part of the picnic.
Well, it's nice to meet
Please feel free to keep going.
Thank you for joining us. Right. So when we think about spiritual practices, when we think about being on a yoga path, when we think about living an informed life. Um, Often the definition is the life that's free from violence. We don't think of violence as having a part to play in an enlightened society. You know, if you read the Bhagavad Gita, nonviolence, ahimsa, is at least a dozen times in the Gita elevated as the most important of all human qualities. So, what do you do when you wish to see your life and the lives of those around you comfortable and free from danger and qualified by nonviolence? What do you do when we live in an environment where violence could be visited upon us at any time? So there's the idealistic, and then there's the realistic, and we need to discuss a little bit about those things. I remember being with my teacher, Prabhupada, and having a discussion with him about peace. Will we ever know peace in the world? And he actually got a little, I wouldn't say he got annoyed at me. I think he was a little maybe disappointed. This was when I was 20 years old. So mind you, it was a few years back, that I should have so not understood what he was trying to teach in Krishna consciousness. Krishna consciousness is not a naive, romanticized, idealistic vision of a world that is violence free. That's just not going to happen. That's not realistic. This is the material world. And not only is it the material world, we're, hip deep in Kali Yuga. Now, if you're not familiar with the yugas, according to Vedic cosmology, the cosmology of ancient India, time is cyclical. It takes place in a series of 4 ages or yugas. The first age is described as an age of peacefulness. That's Satya Yuga. The word Satya can be variously defined as truth, goodness. It's a time of light, a time of God consciousness. And it's an age that lasts a long time. Lifespan, according to the Sanskrit histories, the Puranas, during Satya Yuga was many, many hundreds of years. So Satya Yuga eventually gave way to Treta Yuga. Treta Yuga, which was about 800,000 years ago, according to the Puranas, was the age in which Lord Rama appeared. You may be familiar with the story of the Ramayana, Rama and Hanuman, and the kidnapping of Princess Sita by the demon king Ravana. By the way, if there are any Star Wars fans out there, George Lucas brazenly ripped off the storyline of the Ramayana for creating the initial installment of the Star Wars properties. We'll get into that some other time. But the point is, Satya Yuga gave way to Treta Yuga. Eventually, Treta Yuga gave way to Dvapara Yuga. Dvapara Yuga is the age that ended just prior to the age we are in, Kali Yuga. That was about 5,000 years ago. And with each shift in these ages, there's a downgrading of things. There's a downgrading in the length of life, longevity from its hundreds of years during the golden age, the Satya Yuga, reduced down to a point where now in Kali Yuga, if someone reaches 100 years of age, they're considered very old. Other qualities that dwindle with the passage of time include intelligence, memory, good character, awareness that there is a marvelous, mysterious, divine background to creation. All of these things deteriorate with the passing of time over the yugas, over the ages. And also compassion is lost over time. There was a time when rarely was there ever any flare up of anger. Rarely was there argument. We're going back now a long, long time when the world was simpler. I don't know what you all see when you look out your window. I'm here on Long Island. When I look out my window, I see some trees, and I have a view of the sky. It's a particularly nice day today here on Long Island. The sun is shining, and we're beginning to see some little signs of spring. You know, the flowers are starting to pop their heads up, and I noticed this morning that there was a lot more birds singing than there has been in the winter months. So there's this kind of beautiful shift that's occurring. And in a spiritually grounded society, in a different time, that's perhaps a small taste of what we might expect when there's a rapport between humans and the natural world. If you read the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, you'll read a beautiful description of a time when the human culture and the animal culture and the plant culture were all very much in tune with each other, to the point where, going back to Treta Yuga, to say nothing of Satya Yuga, there was a communication between animals and trees and humans. There are many descriptions in the Ramayana and its sister text, Mahabharata, of humans exchanging ideas and having conversations with members of different animal species and plant species. All of that was possible when we were more attuned to our natural rapport with nature. That's not the case today. If you go back to the roots of free market economics, just a few hundred years ago, really, the purpose behind the Industrial Revolution and the development of technology was actually to give people more time for meditation, for yoga, for contemplation, for study of the sacred texts. We were never meant to become slaves to the system, which is what's happened today. Part of the bitterness, part of the frustration that leads to violence is that the society around us has lost its original spiritual moorings. Originally, if you read, for example, the works of 19th century sociologist Max Weber, you read of a time when pre-modern cultures, before a lot of machinery and technology, people weren't workaholics. They didn't work 10, 12, 15 hours a day. They might have worked 3 or 4 hours a day. Just enough so that there would be ample agricultural productivity, that people would have enough food so that whatever chores needed to be cared for, they were cared for. And people spent most of their day in prayer, in community meetings, with family, getting together for communal meals, celebrations, festivities. The value of time with friends was of central importance. Today, I mean, we're not even talking about the pandemic when we're forced into isolation, but today, friendships have been sacrificed on the altar of economic necessity. And those men and women and children who are left outside the circle of the economically privileged, understandably become hostile. I'm working just as hard as that person over there. How come I don't get my piece of the pie? How come I don't get enough money to be able to take a nice vacation somewhere? How come they have healthcare coverage and I don't? Of course, you people are in Canada. That's not an issue for you. But here in the States, we're in big trouble. Healthcare is a huge issue. Medicines are so expensive. The pharmaceutical industry holds people with health challenges hostage to inflated prices for medications and for hospital care and so on. So it's understandable that people get angry. Somebody's got to be to blame for this. I'm trying my best, but I'm not getting anywhere. I'm miserable. Whose fault is it? And you look for a scapegoat. You look for somebody to blame the woes of the world on. Well, if you're one of those privileged few who doesn't have to deal with that kind of a dilemma, if you come from perhaps a wealthy family, or if you're living your life in such a way that you don't have a lot of expenses. I know people, even some devotee friends in Canada, one in particular, Lavanya Mangala, lives a wonderful life of gardening and poetry and music, and she's always taking care of people by bringing them prasadam. I mean, it's this most inspired life imaginable. There's in sociology, going back to the 1940s, I believe, there was a gentleman named Abraham Maslow who created what he called a scale of needs, a hierarchy of needs. If you envision a pyramid, and the bottom level of the pyramid is your basic needs, paying your rent or utilities or being able to put food on the table, the basic necessities, right? Now you get that level there. And then above that, you come to more free time for hobbies, interests, time with family, and so on. And then moving up and up until you get to the point here, which is a kind of a place of enlightenment. This level here of meeting basic needs doesn't take a lot of money. It takes some money. You have to have some resources to pay bills and so on. But happiness, contentment, all the things that make for a life leading up to actual full self-awareness, that's not an economic challenge. There may be another kind of challenge, focus, attention, and so on. Having a good source of information, a good teacher. So that's different. But meeting those basic needs, that's a fairly inexpensive proposition. Unfortunately today, in Kali Yuga, even that much is a challenge. Even that much, people are working so hard just to meet their basic needs. So where's the opportunity to rise up through those other levels to a point of full contentment and God consciousness? It's a rare thing, which is why we read in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna tells Arjuna asks Krishna a very interesting question. He says, what happens if I can't finish my Krishna consciousness? What happens if in this life I fall away from my spiritual practices? If I can't make it, will I be like a cloud in the sky with no home in this world or the next? What will my fate be? And Krishna says, you don't need to worry about that. Whatever progress you make spiritually, that is your permanent asset. That will never be taken away from you. Spiritual progress is not like material money. When you spend it, it's gone. Spiritual progress is a permanent asset. It's always there. And if this life leads you to fulfill 50% of your journey to full self-awareness, Krishna assures Arjuna, in your next life, you are guaranteed a human birth where you will be able to take up at 51%. You will never lose whatever progress you make in this lifetime. That's yours forever. And what is the situation of someone who has made some spiritual progress? Where do they go in their next life? The Sanskrit is Suchinam Srimatam Gehe Yoga Brashto Bijayate. A yoga brashta is someone who has started their yoga practice in this life, but they haven't finished it before they die. Suchinam Srimatam Gehe. Suchi means that they're born in a family of transcendentalists, a family where your parents have spiritual practice. And therefore, you're encouraged from very early in life to take to a spiritual path yourself. That's Suchinam. Shrimata, Shri means wealth, endowment. So if you're born into a wealthy family, then also you don't have to worry about paying bills. You have more free time for your study, for your chanting of mantras and so on. So this is at least the indication given in the Gita that stick to the path, even if you have difficulty with it, even if there's some challenge there, any progress you make will never be lost. And you can be comfortable knowing that there will be a situation and an environment for you where you will make rapid progress, where you'll pick up your spiritual life very quickly. Maybe some of you, like me, have had the experience of meeting people who were unfamiliar with Krishna or the Bhagavad Gita or yoga practice, and somehow in the space of a day, boom, they're right in there. Just like, boom, they're going full steam ahead. And you're saying, how do they do that? How do they jump in so quickly? And they're picking up the knowledge and they're reciting verses a mile a minute, and they have no problem with the behavioral guidelines, a vegetarian diet and chanting 16 rounds on beads every day, and abstaining from cigarettes and alcohol. And so they just it's like they're picking up somehow very, very quickly from where they left off. And according to the Gita, that's exactly what's happening. They were already familiar enough with spiritual life from their previous lives that in this life they rapidly again get back in that groove. Okay. Those are the exceptions. The general principle, at least in our time today in Kali Yuga, is that people are bitter, they're sad, they're frustrated, they're angry. And so they want someone to blame. Now, my particular field of academic study is the Holocaust. And I have spent many years studying this question. How could humans reach this point? And we talk about violence okay, but the depth and scale of the horrible pain and suffering and excruciating torture that was inflicted on Jews and other minorities, where did that come from? Where does this nature come out? And people ask me, because I lecture about this stuff a lot, people ask me, well, what is your answer to the question? And it's too complicated to answer easily, but I have devised, you might say it's a way of getting out of the question, really. I say, well, from my studies and from what I know in my research, I see that when we neglect our spiritual core, when we forget that we are actually spiritual beings inside this material body and mind, when that dimension of ourselves is forgotten, then we can fall very, very far away. And we equate the acquisitions of material substitutes for that inner pleasure, and can fall very far away and become capable of abominable behavior in pursuit of those material satisfactions, because frankly, there are no material satisfactions. The more you try for them, the more frustrated you become and the more angry you become. This is in, I believe, the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna describes this very brilliant insight into human nature. He says, by contemplating objects of the senses, one develops a desire for those objects. And when one develops a desire for material pleasures and objects and goals, one begins to meditate on how to get those things. And when you do that, when your mind becomes absorbed in them, then you become angry. Why? Well, because either you can't get it, which brings to mind several Rolling Stones songs right now, but we won't go there. Or you get what you want and you realize this isn't doing it for me. This is not making me happy. And when you get angry, Krishna tells Arjuna, your intelligence gets bewildered. You can't be angry and think straight at the same time. It doesn't work. And when intelligence becomes bewildered, memory is lost and one falls down again, adhak. The Sanskrit word is adhak. Fall down again into the whirlpool of birth and death. So if there's ever going to be any hope for escaping violence in a violent time, we have to start with ourselves. We have to start by training ourselves to understand that the real homecoming for the soul is of a different nature than what we're being browbeaten by the propagandists and by the advertising. I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm watching cable news and there are these ads that come on every 2 minutes. I don't know why there's such proliferation of advertising. It's all about telling me how much I need this thing or how much satisfaction I'm going to get from that thing. And, we're surrounded by it all the time. It's very hard to resist it. That's what your spiritual practice is for. Your spiritual practice is a way of indemnifying yourself of, right now here we're getting vaccinations against COVID. I've had 2 Pfizer vaccinations, so I walk around looking obnoxiously immortal right now. But there's a spiritual vaccination, and that's the chanting of the holy names of God. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. That's a vaccination against infection by the material energy. Okay, so that's enough with the formal part of this thing. Let's get to the important stuff. Let's open this up for some discussion, and anyone who would like to either unmute your phone and ask me a question, or if you wish to remain anonymous, you're welcome to type it into the chat box, and I'll do my best.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention again, for those of us who have maybe joined late and didn't hear Audrey's introduction, if anybody does wish to remain anonymous, you can send your questions directly to me. You'll just type in Krishna Prana in the chat box and I'll be able to ask that for you. Or please feel free to raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, first of all, Yogesvara, for this brilliant talk. Like, I was looking at the time just 2 minutes ago, and yeah, that half hour just passed by in a blink.
You're welcome.
We see that Ani has his hand raised right now. I think also, Harry, I saw you physically raising your hand a moment ago. I'm not sure if you were also asking a question, but you're in line next behind Ani if you are. So Ani, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
That was a stretch only. That was a stretch.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Thank you. I was thinking while you were speaking about the different yugas, the different ages, and the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the understanding of lifespan decreasing over time and virtues also decreasing over time. I'm just curious how, in your field, especially in an academic field, like how do we reconcile our modern understanding of science, for example, related to lifespan or to virtues, and what we know of history through scientific calculations compared to information found in these Vedic books, like you're speaking of, like how can we relate to or believe that these things are true, that lifespan was so great hundreds of thousands of years ago and all that? How do you explain that?
Good question. People approach that question. What's your name?
Ani.
Ani, thank you. People approach that question from different levels. Some people attempt to actually find a reconciliation between the Vedic perspective and the archaeological evidence. And that's fine. Sometimes there are points of tangency where these things can fit together. More often than not, the empiric evidence for the history of humankind follows a path that depends on physical evidence. And if the evidence is not there, sometimes some researchers permit themselves to draw conclusions that, I'm trying to remember what this phrase is, that congruency is not causality, I think, something like that. That if something happens in a particular way, it looks like there's a progress to it. You may conclude, therefore, this result happened as a consequence of this cause. So that's very linear thinking. That's not always the case. There may seem to be some kind of a relationship between causes and effects, but the opposite may be true. So that in the Sanskrit Nyaya school of logic and debate, there's something called tal fruit logic. Tal fruit, tal is a kind of fruit that hangs off the bough of a branch of a tree, and a bird lands on the branch of the tree. The tal fruit falls, the bird flies away. So the question is, did the bird landing on the branch cause the fruit to fall? Or was the bird on the branch, the fruit fell, and the falling of the fruit caused the bird to fly away? So it's the kind of argument that can go on ad infinitum. We may never know the answer to that. So another way of reconciling our understanding of knowledge is with, you might say, non-empiric thinking. That is allowing that there are dimensions to what we perceive around us that we are incapable of capturing. And if you allow for that, then it's possible that these things may exist simultaneously. In other words, from the empiric perspective, this is what we know. From the non-empiric perspective, this is what we know. And both can be true. That's the value of living in a multi-dimensional creation. Usually we live our lives in 4 dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions and time. And for the most part, the rules that guide life in those 4 dimensions, we might call that the world of Newtonian physics, works quite well. If I throw Ani a ball and I'm throwing it at a certain speed with a certain amount of pressure, we know we can calculate that it'll land in his hand so many seconds later. That's a simple calculation. So for the most part, that's the world that we live in. When we speak about dimensions beyond the everyday, that kind of approach doesn't necessarily work. For instance, consciousness described in the Upanishads as so small that it'll never be perceived by technical tools of observation. There's no way that you can perceive the soul. It's too small. Just as no one has ever seen an electron. If you're wearing a watch, 90% of the electronics that are going on inside your watch are predicated on the behavior of particles that no one has ever seen. We know them by their symptoms. For example, by using a a gun and shooting a line of electrons through a medium like liquid oxygen, you see the bubbles that the particle forms, like a jet plane passing in the sky. You see the white cloud of fumes coming out of it. You don't see the plane, but you see that cloud of fumes. So we understand consciousness in that same way, not because we directly perceive it, but by its symptoms, by perception, by our ability to experience certain things that are inexplicable by empiric knowledge. So the same is true historically. There can be different ways of understanding the history of the world, some of them based on archaeological evidence, and another way is by perceiving it through the lens of scripture. It's possible that both are real because we live in a multi-dimensional creation. My brother Brian, who is a physicist, I recommend his books, Brian Greene, smart guy, gives the following example. If you think of an ant walking on a line, that's a two-dimensional universe. The ant only has two possibilities, forward and backward. If you move up closer and you see that that line is not a line, but it's a length of garden hose, now all of a sudden, the ant has other options. The ant can go around the hose this way. The ant can go around the hose that way. If you drill a hole in the hose, the ant can go inside, and that there are other dimensions, but we can't perceive those other dimensions. They're too small. So the same is true for our understanding of history. If we allow room for the fact that there are more dimensions to reality than we are capable of perceiving, then you won't be thrown off track by these different interpretations of events.
Thank you so much, Yogeshwar. We have a couple more questions lined up. I'm going to read a question that was sent directly to me from Cade. Could you speak on the topic of day-to-day tips for treating everyone as a spirit soul while still being racially sensitive in this age?
While still being what sensitive?
While still being racially sensitive.
Racially. How to treat everyone equal. Well, oh, I see. Right. Yeah. Quite frankly, and it's a little embarrassing, but quite frankly, since the Black Lives Matter movement, I've become a little bit more aware of my own hidden biases. So I appreciate this question very much. And we want to be equitable. You know, Pandita Samadarshanaha, says the Bhagavad Gita. We'd like to think that we see everyone as spirit soul on an equal level. The fact is we don't. We are conditioned by our upbringing, by our own place in the social or economic pecking order, and we don't always see people in the same way. Or for that matter, if someone has had a sad experience, that tragedy or that trauma in the extreme may affect the way they perceive another group of people. I know I'm not the child of Holocaust survivors. My grandmother was the only one of two survivors in a family of 20 something. The rest were all murdered in the concentration camps. And I know from her side, she's passed away now, others as well, they would never set foot in Germany again. They can't bear to hear people speaking in the German language. They'll never drive a German car. They'll never touch, an appliance if it's made by a German manufacturer. I mean, our attitudes are formed by our experiences. So how to remain equitable toward everyone while also remaining racially sensitive? I don't think I have a good answer for that. It's a really good question. I think we just need to be aware of it. Thank you for asking the question, and best of luck.
Thank you. We have Kamania with her hand up. Kamania, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be wonderful.
So nice to be here. So nice to see you, Yogeshvara Prabhu. Thank you very much.
Hey, Haribo.
I'm happy I can join. It's a feasible time zone for me. So I wanted to ask, we often hear the question, why do bad things happen to good people? I hear so many people ask, if there is a God, why does he, she allow such evil in the world? And I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on how to answer that in a compassionate way that's understandable.
Well, of course, you've just asked one of history's major questions. That's the technical word for what you're asking for is theodicy. Theodicy in religious or philosophical terms means how do we justify, how do we reconcile our belief in a universe, of a purposeful universe, a loving, compassionate God, with the omnipresence of evil and the apparent power of evil over goodness. How do you live with that? How do you figure that out? So again, there's the long form answer, which we don't have time for, and there's the short form answer, which unfortunately will never adequately address the question. But you're entitled to some kind of an answer, so I'll do my best. I recommend a book to you by a rabbi named Harold Kushner. Rabbi Kushner wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He wrote that book because, are you familiar with it, by the way, coming in? When Bad Things Happen to Good People came out maybe 20 years, 25 years ago. Instant bestseller, tiny little book, little thing. And it came out because Kushner and his wife had the very tragic experience of having a child and watching their child die from old age at age 12. He suffered from a disease called progeria. I think it's how it's pronounced, either progeria or progeria, which means rapid aging. And they literally saw their child grow old so that by the time he was 12, he looked like he was 90, with wrinkled skin and so on. And he died of old age at age 12. So here's this rabbi, brought up in a religious family, trained to believe that if you live your life according to the guidelines of goodness, and if you're kind and compassionate and you do things for others and you're charitable, that God will reward you, that the universe will reward you, that goodness will be rewarded. And what we find is that the opposite is actually true. That very often the kindest, best people are the ones who suffer the most. And how is that possible? Well, Kushner tried to go about answering that by popping all of our balloons of the usual answers. What are usual answers? Well, one would be, God only sends difficulties to people who can, meet the challenge, right? If you talk to someone who has lost a partner to cancer, I'll bet you anything that person would say, I'll tell you what, deny me the strength to put up with this and give me my partner back. Right? Or another answer is people will say, bad things happen because there's something we're meant to learn that'll move us forward in our life. My granddaughter, bless her heart, has cerebral palsy, audioneuropathy, dystonia. She can't sit up, she can't speak, she's fed through a tube. What lesson exactly is it that she's supposed to learn from her condition? So that's another balloon that Kushner pops with his pin of inquiry. And like this, he goes through a number of things that we tell ourselves to kind of feel better when bad things happen. I'm going to give an answer that I can't even claim to live up to all the time. So I'm going to admit that to you up front, that I'm still working toward this. What is it that I'm working toward in my own confrontation with evil? It's accepting, as we were discussing with Ani a moment ago, that it is a multi-dimensional creation. And what we are responding to is just the thinnest top dimensions. We're not seeing everything that's going on. And the more we progress spiritually, the more we understand that there is a, you might call it a transcendent cosmic background to creation. Call that background the work of Krishna, the supreme person, if you wish, or you may have some other name for it. The more we're able to breathe through the challenges and the difficulties and the traumas that confront us. Well, what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. This is a story I heard on NPR, National Public Radio, one time. It stayed with me. Let's say that someone is, a soldier is wounded in battle, all right, shot in battle. And that soldier's lying there on the ground thinking, well, I'm not dead. That's good. Also, because I'm wounded, I can't go back into battle. So that means they're going to send me home. That's good. Maybe they'll put me in a hospital, and in hospital I'll meet some, cute nurse. That's good. And when I get back to my hometown, they're going to receive me like a hero. That's good. So when the paramedics show up and say, hey, sorry to see you like this. Do you need any morphine to relieve you from the pain? That person might say, you know what? I'm okay. Save the medication for somebody who needs it more than me. Now, so look at the same situation. Someone shot in a grocery store holdup. The owner of the grocery store is lying on the floor thinking, my insurance isn't going to cover this. I'm going to be out of commission for weeks, and I can't afford to pay someone to take over running the store. I'm going to have to close the store. That means I'm going to go out of business. My family's going to go hungry, and on and on. So when the paramedics show up and say, hey, can you use some morphine? The person who was wounded in the grocery store shooting said, oh, give me everything you got. I'm in such misery. Objectively, those two people may be in the exact same situation, but the way they're processing their situation is totally different, depending on the story they tell themselves internally. Krishna consciousness is the original internal story. Krishna consciousness is the awareness of ourselves as immortal, transcendent beings, caught for the time being within these temporal, physical, and mental frames. And what we call the human condition is being an eternal soul stuck in a temporary body. Awareness of that doesn't eliminate the tragedies, but it does provide something other than the pain to meditate on. All right. So again, I'm not claiming that there's some kind of miracle cure here. What I'm saying is, and this is something that I have experienced, although I'm still working on it, that when you're in a situation of painful distress, the more you've practiced your Krishna consciousness, the more you have another dimension of thinking, feeling, and being to reposition yourself within that will be effective at managing the circumstances you're going through. It won't eliminate them. It's not some miracle cure. Krishna consciousness is not, some magic tablet. You swallow it and everything gets better. That's not what it is. But it will provide you with tools for managing more efficiently and more effectively the circumstances of your life.
Thank you so much, Yogeshwar. I think we'll only have time for one, maybe two more questions because we just want to respect everyone's time. So we have an anonymous question. How does one find time for true spiritual awakening or spiritual practices with the pressures of long hours of work, especially when work is so service oriented and we want to help our fellow humans?
It's very nice. The question alone is glorious. Well, I've found that prayer is a very effective resource. I find that asking for a little help with my spiritual life works quite well. There's an old Sufi saying that what comes from the mouth never goes past the ear. What comes from the heart touches the heart. Prayer is to be offered like that, from the heart. Chanting your mantras, it should be offered from the heart, not just from the mouth. When you do that, when you acknowledge the larger context within which we're operating here, that there is this other dimension, and that's the takeaway here for everyone in this discussion today. There are other dimensions. You can't see them, you can't feel them, you can't hear them. They're there. There are these other dimensions. If you address them, you will find that there are resources that come to your aid that you may not have ever imagined. Prayer is the gateway to these other dimensions. Prayer, chanting, mantras. So that's one way of making time, if you will. There's no one can make time, but we may find a more efficient way of using our time if we simply ask for help. A very practical answer, that's the highfalutin philosophical abstract answer. Here's the practical answer. Write out a schedule for yourself. Sit down and, I do this all the time. I don't leave my home without a pad and pencil. Never. Because first of all, my memory is crazy, stupid. And I need to write things down. But secondly, I find it very useful to spell out the things I'm going to do today every day. And actually, I don't use that's a pad. That's for this discussion group because I need something small. Here's what I usually use. Okay, this notebook, as you can see, every page is written on. I'm not going to let you read it. Okay, I write down everything. And at the beginning of the day, sometimes the night before, I'll say, okay, what do I want to get done tomorrow? And I'll write it down. And if you start by writing down, I'm going to start with chanting 4 rounds on my beads. And then I'll have breakfast. And then I'll do my emails. And then I'll do 3 more rounds or 2 more rounds. You can actually get 16 rounds done if you just plan it out a little bit. And you'll find that your attention to your other responsibilities is sharper and more effective if you break away from them. Step back away from the things you're doing 5-10 minutes. Just take a walk around the block. Go outside your office and chant for a few minutes. What you're doing is allowing the energies to reset. You're allowing everything to kind of come back into focus, and your time will be much more productive. Now, it sounds counterintuitive that if I take time away from what I'm doing, I'll be able to get more done. It works.
Thank you so much, Yogesvara Prabhu, for all of those wonderful answers to everyone's questions. Like I said, we do want to respect everyone's time, including yours. So I think this is probably a good place to wrap up. And I'm going to turn it back over to Audrey for our closing address.
Thank you, Krishna Prana.
Thank you for being with us today. That was a very inspiring community moment. Thank you, Yogesvara, again, to make time for being with us. And hopefully we'll host you again in the future.
Thank you. I would like that. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day and your weekend. Thank you so much.